Not to blame anybody or anything, but I have a lot more gray hairs than I used to. Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to try and cram in all essential information pertaining to U.S. involvement in World War I in a single video under 10 minutes. Yeah, wish me luck. Basically, some royal Austrian dude gets assassinated because some 19-year-old Serbian dude who belonged to a terrorist group called the Black Hand did not like the royal dude guy's country getting all up in his country's business. Austria responds by giving Serbia an ultimatum to which Serbia tries to comply with as much as they can without violating their sovereignty. But it's fruitless because Austria wants a war anyway. Why? Because Germany's got their back. Oh, but Serbia? They got the Russians. So the Russians mobilize on the border of Austria, the Germans declare war on Russia, but the French have an alliance with Russia, so they declare war on Germany. Meanwhile, England is like, no war for us, just some tea and crumpets, please. But then the Germans launched the Schlieffen Plan, which included invading Belgium, where they are known for their chocolate and waffles, and definitely not their guns. This then angers the British because they love Belgian chocolate, and they're like, enough with the crumpets then, it's time for war. So this messy alliance thing really turns a rather small conflict into a full-blown European crisis we now call World War I. Side note, we didn't call it World War I back then because that would require a World War II. Instead, it was known as the Great War. And boy was it great. By great, I mean maximum amount of death and destruction on all sides of the conflict. I'm being sarcastic, of course, but I'm trying to drive the point home that a number of inventions made this war incredibly deadly compared with previous wars. Newly developed military technologies like improved machine guns and artillery were really efficient. And by efficient, I mean they are really good at killing people in a very short period of time. On a single day at the start of the war, about 30,000 French soldiers lost their lives. And that's just on the French side of things. So what did the remaining soldiers do? They dug ditches in the mud so they could hide from bullets. These trenches proved useless, however. Why? Because both sides wound up just waiting each other out. It didn't help that communication lines often became severed because of artillery fire. Coordinated efforts to plan offensive operations became nearly impossible, and no man's land between each fortified position remained, well, no man's land. Meaningful progress could not be made on either side. This is what is known as a stalemate. Eventually we get tanks, poison gas, and flamethrowers to help overcome this lack of progress, but yeah, most of this war was a waiting game. A great many soldiers fighting the war wrote home discussing the boredom they faced stuck in these trenches. That, and they discussed the gnarly feet problems they had, which reminds me, this episode of Cornet's Class is brought to you by Fresh Socks. Did you know that one of the most widely requested commodities of the Western Front was dry socks? Google the phrase trench foot and you'll see why. Be sure to consult your podiatrist before you decide to plant your feet in cold bacteria-infested mud for an extended period of time. The first thing that I need you to know about U.S. involvement in the Great War is that the United States tried really hard to remain neutral, which means we didn't want to get involved. But if you look closely at U.S. exports when the war started in Europe, you would see that the U.S. was definitely trading disproportionately with one side over the other. Which brings me to my next point. The United States made a ton of money off of this war. In fact, Britain didn't fully pay off their war debt until 2006. So how did the US get dragged into this conflict as combatants? Precisely for the reason I just mentioned. Allow me to explain. Shipment of goods to Great Britain became the target of German submarines, or U-boats. You see, the Germans became really frustrated because a British naval blockade of their country strangled them economically, and the Germans could not receive critical supplies for the war effort. What was Germany's response to this naval blockade? Sink every ship coming into Great Britain. There's just one problem with that. Some of those ships had civilians, and some of those civilians were Americans. One such ship, the Lusitania, had 128 Americans on board that perished after it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. This angers the American population, but most Americans still wanted nothing to do with the awful war they were hearing about in the press. So President Wilson, who's up for re-election, promises to not go to war with Germany and maintains that the U.S. should remain neutral. His promise helps him get re-elected to a second term. However, he winds up breaking that promise when a telegram sent to Mexico is intercepted and decoded by British intelligence. This message is known as the Zimmerman telegram, and it basically informs Mexico that the Germans intend to start sinking U.S. vessels again. It also asks that Mexico and Germany form an alliance to make war with the United States. In exchange, Germany promises Mexico its lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona will be returned to them. This information is made public, and Woodrow Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war. Remember, kids, the president cannot declare war according to our Constitution. That is the role of Congress, and it has to be done with a formal vote. So we get involved in the last year of this great war, which, great timing, because we're going to fill a void left by the Russians who had just left the Allied powers. You see, they had an internal problem to deal with called the Bolshevik Revolution. Poverty was rampant, and Russians demanded dramatic changes of their government. And by dramatic, I mean they basically wanted to murder the Tsar and start over. But this time they wanted to bake in some of that communist flavor, which I imagine tastes like cinnamon with a hint of broke. Get it? Because communist countries never have any money and scarcity is a common occurrence. But yeah, Russia has a red revolution, and that is going to cause us to have a little red scare back here at home. But let's get back to the war. The American Expeditionary Forces helped the Allied powers pull off a victory, and now we have to figure out what peace looks like. President Wilson drafts this thing called the 14 Points, where he argues for the free navigation of seas, because we got torpedoed and stuff. And he also calls for an international peacekeeping body called the League of Nations. Pretty much everyone is down for this except a certain U.S. Senator named Henry Cabot Lodge, who's a bit of an isolationist. He rallies Congress to object to the League of Nations and the proposed peace treaty that was to end World War I. And thus, the U.S. fails to become a part of any meaningful solution meant to prevent a World War II. Awesome sauce. Because of the U.S. not ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations becomes a colossal failure. But that's a topic for another day. A couple people we should talk about. The first is Alvin York. He was a deeply religious American who felt conflicted about having to fight when he was first drafted into the war. Some Americans were certainly thankful that he shelved those reservations, however, because he saved numerous lives when he sabotaged a German machine gun nest and captured 132 enemy combatants during the Argonne Offensive. York later received the Medal of Honor, the highest military honor bestowed upon an American service member. The next person I want to bring up, but for a very different reason, is Charles Shank. During World War I, the United States passed two laws, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, both of which made it illegal to criticize U.S. involvement in the war. Shank was arrested for distributing pamphlets urging Americans to not consent to the Selective Service Act, or draft, because that would be a violation of the 13th Amendment, which, as you all should know, prohibits slavery or servitude. He argues in court he was exercising his First Amendment right of free speech. The Supreme Court then takes up his case and determines that his speech was not protected because it presented a clear and present danger to the United States. Since we're on the topic of how World War I affected the lives of Americans back here in the States, let's discuss the home front. I'll start with propaganda. This is something that has always been around and isn't exclusively an American thing, but man, World War I brought propaganda to a whole new level. From encouraging enlistment to asking citizens to grow their own vegetables to asking Americans for their money so the U.S. could pay for the war. Every piece of propaganda served the purpose of helping us win the war. But nobody did propaganda quite like the French. Nothing will mobilize your troops faster than depicting your enemy as a bunch of baby bayoneting barbarians. One last thing before we go, we need to talk about a sizable demographic shift in America. During this period, life for African Americans was a different experience in the South. Segregation was in full swing thanks to Jim Crow laws, and lynchings were a constant reminder of the absence of justice and equal protection under the law. When the Selective Service Act was implemented, more and more Americans were drafted. For that reason, factory jobs became vacant in the North. This presented many African Americans with the opportunity to get away from the racist region ruled by Jim Crow and seek gainful employment elsewhere. We refer to this shift of the black population from the South to the North as the Great Migration. Unfortunately, when whites returned home from the war seeking their old jobs, race riots broke out across the nation and hundreds of African Americans were murdered by angry white mobs in an event known as Red Summer. I just want to add that some of the finest American soldiers during World War I were black. The actions of the Harlem Hellfighters were of such valor that they were awarded the coveted Cross of War by the French government. What awards did these same Americans receive back home? Nothing. That was until last year when President Biden and Congress posthumously awarded the Harlem Hellfighters the Congressional Gold Medal. As you all have learned in class, this country was never perfect, but the best of us Americans have fought and will continue to fight to right the wrongs of history. And one day, you will too. So that does it. I hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. Remember, you don't have to love your country for what it has done, but you should love your country for what it can become. I'll catch you guys next time.